Welcome back to my channel for another Leica episode. I was never super interested in the Leica S3, which you see here in front of me on the table. And the reason is that this camera was announced in 2018 in the first half of the year at the Photokina, and then Leica took 2 years to actually start to ship it to the clients. And in 2 years, a lot of things can happen. Photography further developed. We had other large format sensor cameras coming to the market, more developments, more technology, more innovation, and I thought 2 years passing by between the announcement of a camera and delivering the camera to the client is too long, so I never looked into it. That changed in the last days because thanks to my friends from Leica Switzerland and Leica Zurich, they actually gave to me this Leica S3 here for free for 10 days to test it out, and that's what this video is all about. Let's kick off the video. In contrast to the Fuji GFX cameras and the Hasselblad X cameras or the Hasselblad V system, where you have the CFV50C as a digital back mounted to the 907X from Hasselblad, this camera is still a true DSLR. So there is a mirror in the camera, and I'm going to show this quickly here. Let's open this up. And if we look inside, you see here the mirror. This is still a classical DSLR, and clearly that's something we've not seen for quite a while from Fuji and from Hasselblad, for instance, where only the very large cameras, like for instance the Hasselblad H6D, still is a mirrored camera. Clearly, most large camera manufacturers in the last years moved away from DSLRs and actually came up with new system cameras where you don't have a mirror inside. But I actually like the mechanics coming with a DSLR, and if you just look here into the mechanics, it's quite nice. Let's do a test here. And that reminds me in good old times when I still was myself using DSLRs and not almost completely sitting on system cameras. Let's get the lens back on the camera body here. So this here is the 35mm lens. It's actually a central shutter lens, so it has a leaf shutter in the lens, but in the Leica S3 you can always choose what you want to shoot. So you can switch the camera off, or you can shoot with focal plane shutter, or you can shoot with central shutter, which addresses the leaf shutter built into the lens. And that is an excellent lens, but I also did shoot the camera with my 120mm Apo Macro Summarid S. Widest open aperture is an f2.5, and that's a lens I've shown before mounted on my Leica SL2. Not too long ago I posted that video, and on the Leica SL2 currently I've mounted a 24mm lens, which is another S system lens, an excellent wide angle lens, and this lens I also did shoot on the Leica S3 in order to demonstrate the camera's capabilities. Now, there would be many things to share about the Leica S3. It is a large camera. If you compare it, it's much larger than what you have on the Leica SL2. It is a very robust camera, and people who have this as their main camera in the web, they share that this camera is robust like a tank. You can shoot this under all weather conditions. It will never let you down. All the lenses, including the camera body, are fully weather sealed, and people who have longer experience than me, I just did shoot it for 10 days, they really say this is one of the most reliable companions you can have when you go out in the field and have difficult jobs to do in photography. In contrast to many videos you are used to from my channel, this video is not a full comprehensive review of that camera body in the way I introduced, for instance, a Fuji GFX 100S when it newly hit the market. It is more about impressions, bits and bytes. It is more about showing you some elements of that camera and where you will feel familiar if you shoot, for instance, a Leica SL2, and things which are different. And then most importantly, I want to share lots of sample images which I shot with, the 120mm, the 24mm. I want to look into dynamic range, want to look into portraits, and provide kind of an appetizer what you can expect if you would decide to rent this camera from one of your retail stores, or to maybe purchase it because you're keen in shooting a larger sensor than what you get in a full frame setup like in the Leica SL2 or the Leica M cameras. First of all, the camera weight is substantial. I have a lot of weight in my hand here, but it is very convenient to grab the camera with this hand grip here. And the camera was all the time during these 10 days in a very solid way in my hand. I never had any concerns that the camera could slip, and as people know who follow me on my channel, I'm not really a shoulder strap person, so I really have them in my hand. And the shooting experience with the camera is great. Many familiar elements. So for instance, that top display here we also have, of course, on the Leica SL2. Also in the menu system, lots of familiarities. I will go into the menu very quickly in a moment. And what I also liked a lot, and I mentioned this just a couple of minutes ago, is the sound of the mirror moving when you actually take a shot. It's just so retro. And when I say retro, I don't mean it with a lack of respect, because many people out there still do their professional shootings with DSLRs. It's just that the standard moved to system cameras without a mirror, but that sound reminds me in so many good moments I had in previous times of my life. The camera build is minimalistic in the usual way you have it at Leica cameras. You have the switch here, which I mentioned before, central shutter, focal plane shutter or off. You have a little joystick here, you have a control wheel here, you have a shutter button here. The shutter button is very, very nice, so halfway pressing, then it comes to a clear stop, and then you can push it all the way through to take the shot. You have a control wheel here. You have a record button for video, and that is unusual for large format cameras at the time when this camera was released. Now, of course, in the Fuji GFX and in other large format cameras, we have 4K video recording, but this is really a 4K capable camera, so you can do video with it with some caveats I'm going to mention later. You have another button here, and you have 4 customizable control buttons here, and if I push that, I get first into a status screen giving me the most important information I need to be aware of, and then pushing it again reveals a menu. Here is another part of the menu, and then here you can go through the rest of the menu. And the menu is very much the same of what you know from other Leica cameras. It is so familiar, and I had absolutely no difficulties in getting used to shooting with that Leica S3. Coming back to that switch here, where you can choose focal plane shutter or central shutter, which, as I said before, is the leaf shutter in some of the lenses. Not all Leica S system lenses have actually a leaf shutter built in, but you can recognize it by that little CS here next to the focal length. That, of course, is something very convenient, because if you go for a focal plane shutter, you have the usual restrictions on your flash swing times. But if you go for a leaf shutter, in the same way as on the Hasselblad system, for instance, you can go for really fast shutter speeds and still get your flash working. And that is something very convenient, in particular in the studio, but can also be very helpful out there in the field. Looking at the bottom of the camera reveals the battery mechanism, and it's actually the same as what you have in the Leica Q2, for instance, or in the Leica SL2. You just push the button here, then the battery is released, but it cannot accidentally drop out. You have to give it another gentle push, and then you have it in your hand. And the battery is actually charged here via that charging port, and it comes with a charger. I have it here, and that charger here has something to plug in on the cable. You just go in here, you plug it in, it sits firmly, and then you can charge your battery. And that is a very convenient mechanism. It also contributes a lot to your travel luggage if you are on travel, and works quite well. So let's get the battery back here, and sorry, there is a clear marker here how this should be plugged in. We also have 2 different tripod mounts here, which is quite convenient. No adapter needed. You can just use it on the go. And let's quickly look into the spec sheet, also quickly look into sensor size, make a few remarks on the sensor size, put it in perspective to a full frame camera like the Leica SL2. And then I think it's time to look a little bit into autofocus performance, and then I want to show sample images and basically confirm what I said in the headline of this video. This camera is so much better than I expected. Looking at the sensor of the Leica S3, clearly is a larger sensor than what you have in the full frame camera, like for instance the Leica SL2. And the dimensions are in horizontal direction 45mm, in vertical direction 30mm on the sensor, and that boils down to an aspect ratio of 3:2, which is unusual for large format cameras. And here are some reference points. So on the Hasselblad X1D or X1D Mark II, we have a sensor size of 44 × 33mm, which is an aspect ratio of 4:3, or on the Fuji GFX 100S, to pick one camera from the GFX system, we have a sensor size of 43.8 × 32.9mm, again 4:3 aspect ratio. And the sensor size of these 2 camera systems, the X system from Hasselblad and the GFX system from Fuji, is kind of the same. On the Leica S3 sensor, as said before, 45 × 30mm, which is 3:2 aspect ratio. And if you go to the very large, super professional high-end cameras like the Hasselblad H6D 100C, we have a sensor size of 53.4 × 40mm, and on the sibling on the phase 1 side, we have 54 × 40.5mm. So that is again an aspect ratio on both cameras of 4:3. Now, if we look into a reference to full frame cameras, Again, we have the sensor size of the Leica S3 here, and based on the theorem of Pythagoras, we get a sensor diagonal of 54.1 millimeter. If we do the same exercise on the Leica SL2 sensor, we have the usual film roll size, 36 times 24 millimeter, and that's 43.3 millimeter in the sensor diagonal. And if we build then the crop factor, we end up at 0.80. Applying this to the two lenses I was shooting here, 120 mm f2.5 in its widest open aperture, shot on a Leica S3 camera body, refers to a full frame equivalent field of view of 120 times 0.8, so is corresponding in a full frame equivalent setup to 100 mm focal length and a depth of field of f2.5 times 0.8, which is wider on the full frame equivalent of f2.0. Doing the same with 24 mm, we end up at a full frame equivalent focal length of 19 mm and a depth of field equivalent on the full frame sensor of f2.8 instead of f3.5, widest open on the 24 mm S-system lens. The way I was shooting this camera was exclusively through the optical viewfinder here, and clearly the mirror construction here plays a big role. And that camera has only one autofocus sensor, which is a cross sensor right at the center. And that creates some challenges I realized during my shooting experience. I'm coming back to that in a moment. You can also switch into live view here. There is a button here which you can use. So let's go here to live view. And then you see actually that center cross autofocus point. You can focus. Autofocus is not the quickest on the camera. Sometimes I was going for manual focus, but it actually works quite well. And the Leica S3 has face detection built in on that one single focus point in the center. And that is typically a recipe for a very precise, accurate, typically fast, but in that camera not overly fast autofocus. When I showed before the mirror moving up and down, I really like that sound. Let's listen one more time to that sound here. It's so beautiful, isn't it? What the Leica S3 has not built in, and what I would have appreciated, is focus correction. And what I mean by that is, I think Hasselblad calls it true focus. Phase 1 has a different name for it, but what it basically means is if I look through the optical viewfinder and I focus on the eye of my model, for instance, halfway press the shutter button and then recompose, then this camera is not correcting for that recomposing movement. Whereas in the Hasselblad H6D, for instance, or the Phase 1 XF, for instance, with the IQ4, you have that focus correction built in. And that is something very convenient. So when you focus on the eye of your model and then you recompose, the sensors in the camera should actually be able to detect what the movement was between focusing and then finally, after recomposing, taking the shot and correcting for that difference. And that is not happening in the Leica S3 in contrast to the H6D from Hasselblad, for instance. And that is something which ruins some of my shots, because if you have only one center cross autofocus point, and that is used to focus on the eye of your model, and then you recompose and you have a shallow depth of field coming from a wide open aperture, then the eye might not be as sharp on your model in the final image as you wished. And clearly that is a shortcoming. So I wish actually, and already talked to my friends from Leica Zurich, if Leica is considering an update of the Leica S3, first of all, maybe consider making it a system camera. Second, we need that focus correction, which Hasselblad calls true focus, if you have only one focus point. Well, if they remove the mirror, of course, and turn this into a large format sensor system camera, then there will be more autofocus points anyway, in the same way as we have it in the Hasselblad X1D Mark II or in the Fuji GFX camera series. Looking into the optical viewfinder, it's a pleasure to take shots with it. If you look here, it's clear, it works very well, you can take the shot. I like a lot the way this camera can be operated and handled, and clearly in bright sunlight it's also much better to go for an optical viewfinder like you have it here, even with an underlying mirror construction, than going through the LCD, because in bright sunlight you might not be able to actually get a good view of the scene in front of you. Having said that, what I also missed on the camera, besides having more autofocus points and maybe the option to move the autofocus point with that little joystick here, and what I also said before, namely that there is no focus correction if you focus and recompose, is to check my images via the electronic viewfinder, because this is an optical viewfinder. And what I typically do with my system cameras, after having taken the shot, I look through the electronic viewfinder in bright sunlight, which doesn't then disturb me, and check my images for sharpness and if this is really what I wanted. And that is not possible here on that camera, of course, because it's a purely optical viewfinder, no electronic components, in a way that you can use it for image preview. Storage on the camera body is straightforward. You have a compartment here, there is a compact flash card, there is an SD card, and if you want to go for 4K video, you can do this only if you have a fast compact flash card built into this slot here, and then you can record 4K video. Speaking about video, this is also something I would not recommend the camera for, because 4K video is nice if you read it in a spec sheet, but if the only autofocus point you have is in the center, although it's a very good and highly reliable focus point, that is not good enough for anything what you typically need in video. And you want to have focus tracking, which is not possible with that camera. You have autofocus continuous, but for doing so, you have to half press the shutter button and keep it in that way. And then if you keep your subject in the center on this central focus point, then it will track, but only then. And that is not good enough for professional video shooters, except maybe you are a manual focusing shooter. And if your videography is all about manual focus, then clearly no obstacles with that camera and these S-System lenses. Let's now look into sample images. Let's talk about dynamic range. Let's talk about image quality. I also did a fashion and beauty shooting with one of my models, where, as I said, I had some images to waste because of that lack of focus correction when you focus and recompose. But what I got out of this camera is really not from this world. I think the image quality is fully convincing, although the technology itself is a bit outdated if you compare it with the Fuji GFX 100S or an Hasselblad X1D Mark II. I showed a few sample images already in the intro of that video, and the dynamic range is 15 full stops, which is absolutely amazing. So here's an example. If I reset this image to how it came out of camera, it looks like this. And of course that's a difficult light situation, because in the foreground I have a lot of shadows and in the background I have sunlight. And then correcting this in Lightroom actually took me to this, and this is just amazing how you can pull out information of the shadows. And it's also pinpoint sharp. If you look at it, sharpness in general is a big thing on that camera, because these Leica S lenses, in combination with the larger 45mm times 30mm sensor, they provide an incredible image quality in terms of sharpness, dynamic range, tone and color. And in general, I'm very happy with these results. Here another example of dynamic range. So this is actually inside a building close to Paradeplatz in Zurich. And if I reset this to how the image came out of camera, it looks like this. So most parts of the image are actually completely dark. And then in post-processing, you can get out so much information of the shadows. And it's also, again, pinpoint sharp. If you look at that, there is hardly any noise visible here. It's an ISO of 800 and it looks really, really good. And if you compare that original image after post-processing, that's just amazing and very convincing. Here's the last example for dynamic range, which I wanted to show, and that image came out of camera like this. And clearly there is a lot of shadow on the sidelines here, and only on the sky we have bright sunlight, and that is always very challenging. And the question is, in post-processing, how much information can you get out of shadows here? And I'd rather expose typically for highlights to get them correct in order to avoid clipping and overblown highlights, and then I hope to get my information back out of shadows in post-processing. What you also see here is an incredible amount of detail in these images. This looks really, really good. And again, is a challenge in terms of lighting for the camera, but worked very well for this image here. The images I've discussed so far, they were shot with the 24mm wide-angle S lens, of course. And now I want to show how this looks like if you shoot the 120mm macro widest open f2.5 on that camera here. And I want to start actually with an interesting example. First of all, you see how dreamy this is. And this is just perfect, because the characteristics of larger sensors for medium format, but also these crop medium format sensors, is that the transition between sharp foreground and smooth background is more pleasant than what you have on smaller sensors. And here you see, by the way, how I missed my focus. So I wanted to focus here on the left-hand side eye, but the focus was actually sitting on the right-hand side eye because my focus recompose, as I explained it before, was not really working. It's nevertheless a very good image, a very dreamy image, and I still like it, but it was planned to have the focus sitting on the other eye and not in the way you see it here. If I would look for one word to describe the combination of the Leica S3 with this 120mm S lens, it's dreamy. If you look at that image here, just dreamy, very nice, very pleasant in the way it appears. Or for instance, this one here. I think dreamy is the right word to describe it. By the way, there is something I wanted to mention. And in my shooting, I realized that for aperture priority, for instance, when the camera figures out exposure by itself, it actually creates a bit darker images than what I'm used to from the Leica SL2. That's interesting and required a bit more correction in post. I've read in the web that others made the same experience. I think it can be handled. It's not really a problem. And it's the way the Leica S3 is calibrated by Leica, but it's something which at least I wanted to mention and noticed in my shooting. Here another example where you see the sharpness you get if your focus is sitting correctly. As I said, I missed true focus, which we get on the Hasselblad H6D or on a Phase 1, or maybe more focus points like we have it on other large sensor cameras. But if the focus is sitting, it's very reliable and it's pinpoint sharp, as you can see here. So that was shot at an aperture of f4.0, still very dreamy, very smooth background bokeh here, quite nice. And in general, I think there is not much more to say because you saw sample images, I made the points I wanted to make. Maybe on depth of field, here is an example for a shot at f2.5. And I was shooting actually my DJI Mini 3 Pro. And if you look at the camera where the focus was sitting is pinpoint sharp, but the moment in time you get back by a few centimeters, it's already becoming to be blurry and fuzzy. In the last years, I repeatedly got the question from people visiting my channel what I personally think about the Leica S3. And my answer was always the same, namely what I said at the beginning of the video. The camera is outdated because it was announced and developed for 2018 but not released before the first half of 2020 when it was finally shipped to the clients, and that's why I never was interested in it. Now, having this camera for 10 days, it really changed my mind, and that change is driven by one thing only, namely image quality and shooting experience. And the camera body is so robust, I could imagine this camera going with you to Alaska, you know, dropping down in the snow, having no harm at all, and you can still shoot. It's robust like a tank. Image quality is something of the best I've ever seen. It's not as large on the sensor format as what you get in a Hasselblad H6D or a Phase 1 IQ4, but it's substantially larger than what you get on a full frame camera body. And because I like the image quality from that camera so much, and because I'm pretty sure that Leica will look into a revision and updated model on the Leica S system in the next 12 months, is my personal guess. I already said to my friends from Leica Zurich, if that camera is available in a new version, which has overcome some of the difficulties and challenges I described when it comes to autofocus, no flexibility with the autofocus field, and maybe also convert this into a system camera, I will clearly be one who is considering to purchase that camera body. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.